was motivated by a concern that firms weren't taking seriously the problem of climate change and global warming, and in particular weren't really taking actions to reduce their carbon footprints. So what I wanted to do was to see what we could learn by looking at public disclosures about what these firms were doing. We tend to have a feeling in the literature that more disclosure is better, but I'm not sure that that's the case. And certainly Hopwood raised a concern that what can happen when you disclose more is people assume you're doing good things and actually stop providing the sort of scrutiny that might be necessary. So I was concerned that firms might be creating the impression through disclosures that they were serious about carbon footprints, when in fact they were putting out some nice warm fluffy statements but doing very little. So what I did was I examined the carbon-related disclosures of 50 of Australia's largest listed companies. I looked in their annual reports and I looked in their sustainability reports. And what I was looking for was evidence as to whether they were really telling us something instrumental about their behaviours, this is what we're doing to reduce carbon footprints, or whether they were behaving what I call symbolically and saying, you know, we care about the climate, carbon footprint's important, but not really telling us much about what they were doing. In that case, I would say they were pursuing pragmatic legitimacy, making themselves sound good but not doing much. If, however, they were talking about behaviour, talking about things they were doing to reduce their impact, that's an example of what I would call moral legitimacy. And they're not my terms, they're terms from the literature, but they're not ones that we tend to apply. We tend to think about legitimacy as a much sort of broader concept. So what I tried to do was break down those two ideas of legitimacy and see what was happening. I split my sample into more carbon intensive and less carbon intensive firms because we might expect differences across the two. And I looked at their narrative disclosures and inductively derived categories that indicated were these symbolic parenthood sort of statements or were they instrumental comments about what they were doing to reduce their footprint or help others reduce their footprint. What I found was that the more carbon intensive firms, I did a comparative period from 2005 to 2008, and over that time the more carbon intensive firms really seemed to be adopting more of an instrumental approach. They were changing what they were doing, they were reporting on specific actions to reduce their footprints. However, the less intensive sector went the other way. They were actually making less instrumental disclosures and more symbolic ones, and they were making less disclosure than the other sector. Now you might say that's what you'd expect, less disclosure, and perhaps that's true. But why would we expect less instrumental disclosure? Why wouldn't they still be talking about what they were doing? And the really disturbing part of that was, I think it was around 2/3 of that non-intensive sample were large financial institutions. These are people with a lot of economic power over those with whom they deal. And the literature increasingly tells us if we're going to breach the carbon chasm, if we're going to solve the problem, it's not enough to look after our own issues. We need to engage with all of those in our supply chains, our customers, our employers, and help them reduce their carbon footprints. I would argue that financial institutions are in a very good position to do that. One of the categories of disclosure that I coded was whether the disclosures indicated that the firm was helping others to reduce their carbon footprints, and sadly this was a virtually zero disclosures on that score for this group of companies. So I think what we've got is a wasted opportunity. We've got a group who can really influence the behaviour of others, but it doesn't seem to be happening. So I think there's perhaps an opportunity for something to be done there to encourage those with economic power to engage with their suppliers, customers and so on. With respect to the carbon intensive sector, it was encouraging to see the disclosures that we did, but they were varied. There's clearly an opportunity for these firms to be cherry picking and selectively reporting on their activities. So perhaps again what we might need to think about is encouraging some sort of, if not a regulatory solution, some sort of voluntary code to get some consistency so that we can really learn how well we're progressing with the carbon footprint.